I got another video email this morning. An email showing a monarch butterfly flying off the ends of the hands of a friend of mine. We'll call him Joe. Joe's going through a rough time right now. He's dealing with his wife having cancer, and this is the third time that it's come back. And so every time I see those butterflies flying off of his finger in slow motion, so exquisite, I think about how loss is about letting go, releasing, and I almost see her spirit flying away with those butterflies. And that's what grief and loss are about, letting go. I actually have a lot of friends right now who are going through difficult times, not just Joe. Two professional women, both of who have husbands who have recently been diagnosed with cancer, one with pancreatic and the other with leukemia. And then I got a call not too long ago from the partner of my ex-husband telling me that he had been in a bike accident. I was like, oh my God. And he had traumatic brain damage. And his mind is scrambled up. And so I realized that loss and losing a partner is a process of letting go. Sometimes it's not all at once. Sometimes there are losses along the way. For example, my friend Joe, he is now, or those other people, they're in the position of being caregivers. And so the relationship with your partner changes. It's not that nice, convenient husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend. It becomes slightly uneven. The caregiver and the patient. And that's a change, and that's a loss. And in the case of my ex-husband, loss of a personality. When my father died, he died from Alzheimer's, and I watched my mother lose my father bit by bit by bit. But we lost her bit by bit too, because she had breast cancer, then she had a brain tumor, and they kept on cutting more and more pieces out of her. And so oftentimes loss is a series of losses. And that doesn't even account for the friend losses. Friends? Yes. We live in a culture in which death is really scary. We don't embrace it. We deny it. And it's much easier to just get caught up in your busyness and not reach out to your friends who are struggling with this progressive loss. And then death brings on a whole different level. I did a documentary film series, and in one of the films was about grief and loss. And one of my interviewees talked about his wife who was dying from lung cancer, and how when she would go off to work, we used to sit on the couch and think, well, this will be the way it is when she's gone. Of course, it's never like that. It's very, very different. And okay, so sometimes cancer is not a death sentence, and you can survive, but it's always a calling card, death's calling card, a reminder that we do not live forever. Now, in some ways, I would say that's a good thing to remind you of, but people don't like to be reminded of that. And I was reminded of that this morning and seeing those slow motion videos of the butterflies flying off. And butterflies, of course, have a very, very short lifespan. And so there was this releasing into the heavens, these beautiful butterflies. I have been counseling people through major life challenges, grief and loss, for almost 20 years. I know the territory, not only through my own losses, my mother and my father, my brother, a dear friend, my husband, first husband, when he left me, which is not quite the same as dying, and I will talk about that another time. And I also worked in hospice. After my parents died, I joined hospice, and I made bereavement calls and led hospice support groups for over 5 years. So I know the territory. I would like to share a little bit of that territory. Of course, some of you may already know this, but in the first 3 months, there is this shock, this disorganization, particularly if the death has been sudden. And who's to say sudden? Well, I coached women who one day their husband was alive and the next day he was dead, like instant. One client, her partner went off on a bike ride, had a heart attack, and it was over. And this is a kind of loss that takes a lot of getting used to. But any kind of loss, in those first 3 months, there is a disorganization of the brain. The brain literally has a hard time computing that that other person is no longer there. And the more that person is embedded in your daily life, the more we're interwoven, the more difficult it is, because everything reminds you of the loss. In hospice, we usually didn't even call people until after the first 3 months. And we would send a bereavement card, and there had been a social worker or counselor who saw the survivor before the death. But generally, we didn't call them unless they were what they call at risk. Somebody who had maybe had multiple losses or had expressed severe concern about how they were going to live after their partner had died. Then in 3 months, some of the numbing goes away, which actually is more difficult because now you're really feeling the loss. This is when people typically join support groups. And support groups can be amazing organizations because the person who is the widow or the widower has support of other people who have experienced the same territory. And that is very reassuring and consoling. Now, the downside of it, from my point of view, is that because there's so much talk about the loss, it actually re-triggers the body. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the biology of grief in a minute. The other problem I see with support groups, especially if they're long-term, the groups that I ran, it was continuous and people could stay as long as they wanted, is that the people bond within those groups and then they don't want to leave because that's where their friends are. They've lost their other community and that becomes the community. But that's a way of actually holding you back from moving forward. So the stories can re-trigger the grief. You can get stuck in the group. And when I first started doing support groups, I actually found members who had been there for 2 and 3 years and had enshrined the loss. And that's one of the pitfalls or the difficulties that happen around grief and loss, is that you don't want to let go of that partner. And so you enshrine them and your whole life becomes wrapped around them. Sometimes this is manifested in the form of being the curator of your partner's legacy. Maybe they were a photographer or an artist, and you feel responsible for somehow getting their work out into the universe, out into the world. And so you maintain that. I remember another story about a wife whose husband died from a very, very painful death, from a very painful illness. It may have been bone cancer. And she got involved with Compassionate Choices to bring that choice of doctor-assisted or compassionate choices, I guess is the euphemism they use, for about 3 or 4 years. And that became her way of continuing that relationship. But it does hold back the healing. And it holds you back from moving on to where your next life what your life is going to be after that loss, which is what I do in the work I do with my clients. Most people tend to tamp their emotions down because that's what we're taught in this culture. We are a death denying culture, and we are an emotion denying culture. We are not as bad as the British are in terms of holding down our feelings, but we are pretty reserved when it comes to grief and loss. As a PhD psychosocial analyst and coach, I have found two really important keys to navigating the territory of grief and loss around partner loss. Well, actually, any loss. And those are the body and the brain. Remember, I said before that I would talk to you a little bit about the biology of grief. And there is a biology. Grief actually is a physiological response to the loss of a bond, a loss of a significant connection. And when that happens, two responses are triggered. One is a survival response, because human beings, as herd animals, actually depend upon their relationship with other people to survive. So when you lose a significant other, that bond is triggering a survival response. And sometimes it's actually real. That is, if you lose your major breadwinner, you're a young wife with children to support, that is huge, and it will trigger a survival response. But sometimes you're not even aware of it. But the chemicals in your body are actually triggering that survival response. That's why sometimes, it's fight, flee, freeze. So sometimes you see people who they just freeze. They don't do anything. They get stuck and trapped in immobility. And then you get other people who run away. They take trips all over the place, and they never want to be home because they want to pretend that it doesn't even exist. And then you see the anger response. Oftentimes you see the survivor getting into conflicts with the hospitals or medical establishment over the handling of the person who has died. Sometimes lawsuits. So those are all signs of fight, flee, freeze. But in addition, there is an addition. There is a mechanism, there are many mechanisms that keep us together. Mother Nature wants us to bond because it needs us. She needs us to stay together when we have children. Human children take many, many years to grow up. And one person is not enough, at least in the early history of human beings. You needed both the husband, the father, and the mother to be able to bring up a child. In fact, you needed a whole community. And that's one of the downsides of our modern society, is that we don't have the same community support that we used to. And that has a huge, and that brings me to actually the third key, which is community, and I'll get back to that. Anyway, there is this physiological response of fight, flee, freeze, and then there's this loss of one of the chemicals, one of the hormones, which is oxytocin. So you actually feel depressed, miserable, horrible. The intention of Mother Nature is for you to rebond again, because that's the best thing for you to do. In elephants, when a member of the herd dies and the closest relative is grieving the loss, and elephants do grieve, the herd stands around and protects that elephant, either baby or mother, and stays, and maybe even makes these kind of rumbling noises that are soothing to help. And then after a day or two, they actually take that animal and bring it back into the herd. We don't do that, and yet we need to. Oftentimes what happens, though, is our community runs away. I had a friend who knew a lot about death. She'd written several books about it. And when her husband died, she had two close friends that she was counting on to help her get through the difficult patches. and they came to her house at the same time, and one was a man and one was a woman. And guess what? They fell in love and they left her behind. And that's not unusual. It's hard, it's difficult, it's challenging to be around somebody who's grieving because it brings up so much in ourselves, our own fears. Like this morning, thinking about those butterflies, it triggered grief in me. And I felt so aware of my gratitude for my husband, and yet the awareness also that he could die before me. There are no guarantees of who's going to go first. And there's no free lunch. If you were the first to go and you die from an illness, you go through a period of letting go of everything, and you have to face leaving your partner. One of the other people in one of my other documentaries, she said she was going through very near-death experiences, and she said when she looked into her parents' eyes and saw their sorrow, it was the hardest thing of all. So it's challenging. Okay, so the body. So the other part is the brain. And this is the thoughts that we bring to our situation. How are we looking at our experience? And oftentimes after you lose somebody, because you feel bad, you think bad. You think that it's never going to be over. That actually the more pleasure is in being back in the past. And that often leads to that enshrinement, is that you prefer to be in the past and remembering the past and maybe looking at old videos and maybe even talking to your spouse in the other realm. And the longer you do that, the problem is the longer you do that, you're actually creating new neural networks in your brain, which become reinforced over time when you keep on doing that again and again and again. However, no fears, you can change. I had a client who came to me actively grieving the loss of her husband after 20 years. I mean, literally tears. She came to my group and there were tears, and she told me that whenever she saw her son, she would burst into tears. Of course, this was a little disturbing for him. And she went to see psychotherapists and psychoanalysts, and finally she came to me, and within 3 months, she had stopped the crying and she had gotten a new life. And that's what I offer. It's not just getting over the grief. It's not just getting it so that it doesn't bother you anymore, but actually using it as a doorway to your next life. And also as a way to heal all wounds and trauma. Because all the grief, all the loss is connected. And so it is an opportunity to heal those things. I had another client who came to me. She had lost her partner and she was grieving a lot, but a lot of the grief was the loss of her mother when she was very young, and that her partner had in many ways provided that surrogate mother for her. And so the grief was much, much deeper and required healing the loss of her mother as well as her partner. I had another woman who came to me. She was in her 80s, and she was having trouble with her relationship with her daughters and her granddaughters. And when I worked with her, we discovered, or she revealed to me, that not too long after she lost her husband over 50 years ago, she'd gotten involved with this man. And in order to please him, she cut off her relationship with her daughters when her granddaughters were very young. And there was a breach. And of course, he didn't stay with her. And then she was left with a double loss. We worked on the loss of her husband 50 years ago. And then she was able to start working on her relationship with her daughters and her granddaughters. So community. Let's talk a little bit about community. I've already said that we're a culture that denies um, death, and that's oftentimes not only do you lose your partner, but you lose your friends, particularly your married friends who do not want a widow in their midst. And they don't want to be reminded that they too, one of them, will lose a partner. That it is very rare that both people will die at the same time. My parents died 6 months apart, but there was still 6 months of grieving. I had a client who he thought he was going to go first. And by the way, there are no guarantees. He actually had a bad ticker, a bad heart, and he had a pacemaker and he had a heart failure. And he was sure that he was the one who was going to go first, and his wife got cancer and died. And now he had to deal with the grief and loss. And we worked together, and he lived for another year and a half. And in that time, he did so much healing and so much self-discovery. That is the gift of grief, is that you can really transform. And that's what I offer in my programs. It's release your grief and thrive. How to find love again for yourself. How to rekindle that love. How to allow yourself to allow love in. I have another client who is grieving the loss of her husband and has difficulties because of the aloneness. He's actually been gone for 4 years, but she's having trouble with aloneness. And it turns out that when she was a baby, she got pneumonia and was in an isolation unit for almost a week. And that traumatized her. Things that happen to us in those first 2 or 3 years have huge impact because it happens before we have any cognitive facility, and it affects us at a traumatic level, and you need to heal those traumas before you can move forward. And so there is right now difficulty for her re-engaging with people because of the fear of being abandoned again. So my program, as I said, helps you to release the emotional energy. You don't tamp it down. You don't ignore it. You don't get caught up in it. You don't enshrine it. I teach you how to change the story. And I also provide that support. But unlike the support group, you don't get bonded to me. It is temporary, and I work on providing you with the tools that you need to move forward in your life. So that when we're finished, you actually have a life and you have a reconnection to yourself and what you're meant to be doing. Very often, there is a reason why we're still here. And that is the fourth key. And that is our brilliance. Why we are here, what our purpose is. So if you resonate with what I've been talking about, I invite you to have a conversation with me, see how I work, find out if we are a fit. There is a link in the comments section. Go ahead and schedule a free 15 to 20 minute conversation with me, and let's find out how I might help you. That's it for today. Be brilliant. And come back on Monday when I will be doing another Facebook Live around this time, somewhere between 1 and 2. That's it. Bye for now.